Private Lowell Hollingshead from California pressed himself against the muddy earth. As German shells exploded around their improvised positions, the battalion had no heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and rapidly dwindling food supplies. Worst of all, they had no reliable way to communicate their position to American forces, who might unknowingly shell their own men while attempting to provide support. The German commander, recognizing the propaganda value of capturing an entire American battalion, sent a surrender demand under a white flag. The message, delivered by a German lieutenant who spoke perfect English, was polite but firm: surrender immediately or face annihilation. Major Whittlesey's response would become legendary in American military folklore. He tore up the surrender note without bothering to reply. What followed was a 6-day siege that tested every man's endurance to its limits. The Germans launched attack after attack, probing for weaknesses in the American perimeter. Machine gun fire swept the ravine constantly, making any movement during daylight hours potentially fatal. The Americans were forced to ration their water, collecting what they could from muddy shell holes contaminated with gas and debris. According to reports preserved in the National Archives, the psychological pressure was perhaps worse than the physical hardships. The sounds of battle raged around them as other American units attempted to break through German lines to reach them. Sometimes the fighting seemed close enough to touch, but rescue never came. Hope and despair alternated with each passing hour. Corporal Irving Potts, a former New York newspaper reporter, kept a makeshift diary of their ordeal. His entries, later published in the New York World, capture the desperate courage of men who refused to surrender despite impossible odds. "We are Americans," he wrote, "and Americans do not surrender to Germans." The most heartbreaking moment came when American artillery, unaware of the battalion's exact position, began shelling their location. The trapped soldiers were forced to watch helplessly as their own army's shells fell among them, killing and wounding men who had already endured days of German attacks. Several attempts to signal their positions failed, and the friendly fire continued sporadically throughout their ordeal. Private Abraham Krotoshinski, a Polish immigrant who had volunteered for the dangerous mission of carrying messages through German lines, became one of the few links between the trapped battalion and the outside world. Time and again, he slipped through enemy positions under cover of darkness, carrying desperate pleas for help and information about their deteriorating situation. The German attacks grew more sophisticated as the siege continued. Stormtroopers, elite German assault troops, attempted to infiltrate American positions under cover of darkness. Hand-to-hand combat became commonplace as the perimeter shrank and ammunition ran low. Every man, regardless of his original role, became a rifleman fighting for survival. By October 7th, when relief finally arrived, the lost battalion had been reduced to fewer than 200 effective soldiers. They had held their position for 6 days without resupply, without reinforcement, and without hope of easy rescue. Their story would inspire countless Americans and prove that the new American army possessed the same fighting spirit that had won independence and preserved the Union. Major Whittlesey, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the siege, never spoke proudly of the episode. For him, the lost battalion represented not triumph, but tragedy, the unnecessary loss of brave men due to poor planning and inadequate communication. The scars of those 6 days in the Argonne would haunt him for the rest of his life. The name Alvin York had been unknown to most Americans before October 8, 1918, but by the end of that blood-soaked day, the Tennessee Mountain Man would become the most famous soldier in the American Expeditionary Forces. What happened in a small clearing in the Argonne forest would transform a reluctant warrior into a national hero and demonstrate the individual courage that could turn the tide of battle. Sergeant York, leading a patrol of 17 men from the 82nd Division, had been tasked with silencing German machine gun nests that were holding up the American advance. The morning was typical for the Argonne: cold, wet, and filled with the distant sounds of artillery and rifle fire. None of the men in York's patrol expected to become part of military legend. The patrol worked its way through the forest, using every available bit of cover to avoid German observation posts. York's hunting skills, learned in the mountains of Tennessee, proved invaluable as he led his men around enemy positions. But as they approached their objective, the patrol stumbled into a German headquarters unit, capturing several officers and enlisted men. Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, commanding the German position, realized immediately that his situation was desperate. The American patrol had captured crucial intelligence about German defensive positions. and their escape would compromise the entire sector. He quickly organized a counterattack, hoping to eliminate the Americans before they could return to their own lines. What followed was a firefight that would be studied in military academies for generations. As German machine guns opened fire on the patrol, York found himself in a position where his remarkable marksmanship could make a difference. Using skills honed hunting wild turkeys in the Tennessee hills, he began systematically eliminating German machine gunners with single, well-aimed shots. The fighting was intense and personal. Private Murray Savage from New York, one of York's patrol members, later described the experience as like being in a tornado made of bullets. German soldiers, realizing they were facing an exceptionally skilled marksman, began to focus their fire on York's position. But the Tennessee sergeant seemed to lead a charmed life, moving from cover to cover while continuing his deadly work. According to the official after-action report filed by Major George Edward Buxton, York's actions during the engagement bordered on the incredible. Armed with only a rifle and a pistol, he killed over 20 German soldiers and captured 130 prisoners, including 4 officers. The German commander, Lieutenant Vollmer, surrendered his sword to York personally, acknowledging the Americans' extraordinary feat of arms. The psychological impact of York's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German defenders throughout the sector began to question whether they could hold their positions against soldiers capable of such individual heroism. The story spread through both armies with remarkable speed, boosting American morale while correspondingly damaging German confidence. Meanwhile, other American units were achieving their own remarkable victories. The 7th Division, still recovering from the Lost Battalion ordeal, had reorganized and resumed their advance. Lieutenant Colonel William Donovan, commanding a battalion of the fighting 69th Regiment, led a successful assault on German positions near Landers at St. George's, earning him the nickname Wild Bill for his aggressive leadership. The French forces, fighting alongside their American allies, were also experiencing renewed success. General Henry Gorough's Fourth Army had broken through German lines near Reims, capturing thousands of prisoners and dozens of artillery pieces. The coordination between French and American forces, initially problematic, was improving as both armies gained experience fighting together. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading fighter ace, was achieving air superiority over the battlefield. His encounters with German pilots, including several victories against the famous flying circus units, were providing crucial support for ground operations. The skies above the Argonne, once dominated by German aircraft, were increasingly controlled by American and Allied pilots. The German High Command was beginning to recognize that their situation was becoming untenable. General Erich Ludendorff, the architect of Germany's military strategy, was privately admitting to Kaiser Wilhelm II that the war could not be won. The combination of American industrial capacity, fresh troops, and individual heroism, like that displayed by Sergeant York, was proving overwhelming. As news of York's achievements spread back to the United States, he became an instant celebrity. Newspapers across America carried his story, and his hometown of Pall Mall, Tennessee, became a destination for reporters seeking to understand how a humble mountain man had become such an effective warrior. York himself remained characteristically modest, crediting his success to divine providence and his Tennessee upbringing. The day's fighting marked a turning point in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The combination of tactical success and individual heroism had finally cracked the German defensive system that had held for so long. The road to victory was now open, but the cost had been enormous, and the final battle still lay ahead. By November 1st, 1918, the strategic situation facing the German Empire had become desperate beyond imagination. Kaiser Wilhelm II paced the floors of his palace, receiving reports that confirmed his worst fears. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had shattered the Hindenburg Line, and American forces were advancing rapidly toward the vital railroad junction at Sedan. General Erich Ludendorff, the brilliant tactician who had masterminded Germany's military strategy throughout the war, found himself confronting an impossible situation. The German Fourth Army, which had held the Argonne forest for months, was in full retreat. American artillery, now positioned on the heights overlooking the Meuse River, could interdict German supply lines at will. The breakthrough had come after weeks of grinding attritional warfare. American forces, led by General Hunter Liggett, who had replaced the exhausted First Army commander, had finally learned to coordinate their attacks effectively. The lessons purchased with blood during the early weeks of the offensive were now paying dividends. As American units moved with increasing skill and confidence, Private Eddie Rickenbacker, no longer the rookie who had entered the Argonne in September, advanced with his company through the shattered remnants of what had once been the German front line. The landscape bore testimony to the ferocity of the fighting, shell holes filled with stagnant water, twisted metal from destroyed artillery pieces, and the shallow graves of soldiers from both armies who had died far from home. The German retreat was not a rout, but it was unmistakably a defeat. Veteran units that had held their ground against every previous Allied assault were now falling back in organized but steady withdrawal. The sight of German soldiers moving away from positions they had defended with their lives was profoundly demoralizing to the remaining defenders. According to intelligence reports compiled by American military intelligence officers, German morale was collapsing throughout the Western Front. Desertion rates were climbing, and entire units were surrendering without offering serious resistance. The fighting spirit that had sustained the German army through 4 years of war was finally breaking under the strain of facing fresh American divisions. The human cost of the offensive was staggering. American casualties had exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded, making the Meuse-Argonne the bloodiest single battle in American military history. French losses were equally severe, and German casualties were estimated to be even higher. The Argonne forest had become a vast cemetery, with soldiers from 3 nations buried beneath its tortured soil. Behind the lines, the German home front was also crumbling. Revolution was spreading through German cities as workers and sailors refused to continue supporting a war that could no longer be won. The Kaiser's authority was evaporating, and political leaders were desperately seeking a way to end the conflict. Before complete collapse became inevitable, Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding Army Group North, sent increasingly urgent messages to Berlin requesting permission to begin peace negotiations. His forces were intact but exhausted, and he could see no possibility of stopping the Allied advance. The strategic reserve that might have halted the American breakthrough had been committed piecemeal and destroyed in earlier fighting. The American advance was gaining momentum daily. The 1st Division, veteran of battles from Cantigny to St. Mihiel, was approaching the outskirts of Sedan. The 2nd Division, which had stopped the German advance at Bellewood, was pushing toward Normandy. The entire German defensive system in the west was unraveling. As American forces exploited their breakthrough, General John J. Pershing, vindicated in his insistence on maintaining independent American command, was planning the final phase of operations that would drive German forces from French soil entirely. His army, which had begun the offensive as a collection of untested divisions, had evolved into a formidable fighting force capable of meeting German veterans on equal terms. The psychological impact of American success extended far beyond the battlefield. In Berlin, political leaders who had once dismissed American military capabilities were now pleading for armistice negotiations. The reality of American industrial and military power, combined with the fighting quality of individual American soldiers, had finally convinced German leadership that victory was impossible. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary signed a separate armistice with the Allies, leaving Germany completely isolated. The news reached German troops in the Argonne just as they were attempting to establish new defensive lines. The knowledge that their last ally had abandoned the struggle had a devastating effect on morale among soldiers who had already endured more than human endurance should allow. The end was approaching rapidly, but the final act of the Great War would require several more days of fighting and dying in the forests of northeastern France. November 11th, 1918, dawned crisp and clear over the battlefields of France. But the morning brought more than just another day of warfare. It brought the promise of peace. At 11 o'clock, the guns that had thundered across Europe for over 4 years would finally fall silent, and the Great War would end. General Ferdinand Foch, Supreme Allied Commander, had signed the armistice agreement with German representatives in his private railroad car in the forest of Compiègne at 5 o'clock that morning. The terms were harsh, but not unexpected. German forces would evacuate all occupied territory, surrender their fleet and air force, and accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland. The war that had consumed a generation was finally over, but for the soldiers still fighting in the Argonne forest, the news came slowly and with mixed emotions. Private Henry Gunther of Baltimore would have the tragic distinction of being the last American soldier killed in the war, shot by a German machine gunner at 10:59 in the morning. Just 1 minute before the ceasefire took effect, his death epitomized the terrible waste of a conflict that had claimed millions of lives. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, who had led his tanks through the forest with characteristic aggression, found himself strangely melancholy as the fighting ended. The young officer, who would later become one of America's most famous generals, worried that peace might rob him of the opportunity to prove himself in battle. Little did he know that an even greater war lay ahead in his future. Sergeant Alvin York, the Tennessee marksman whose exploits had made him famous throughout America, was among the first to lay down his weapons when the armistice took effect. The reluctant warrior, who had once sought conscientious objector status, was eager to return to his mountain home, and the simple life he had known before the war transformed him into a national hero. The German soldiers facing the Americans were equally relieved that the killing had stopped. Many of them were barely older than boys, called up in the desperate final months of the war as Germany's manpower reserves were exhausted. They had fought bravely despite knowing their cause was lost, and they welcomed the chance to return to homes they might never have seen again. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Stars and Stripes military newspaper, the moment of ceasefire was surreal for soldiers who had lived with constant danger for months. The sudden silence seemed almost oppressive after the continuous noise of artillery and machine gun fire. Some men found themselves unable to believe that they had survived the war intact. The cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive had been enormous, but so had its strategic importance. American forces had broken the back of German resistance in the West, capturing over 16,000 prisoners and hundreds of artillery pieces. More importantly, they had proven that the United States could field and sustain a modern army capable of decisive action on European battlefields. General John J. Pershing, watching from his headquarters as reports of the ceasefire reached American units throughout the forest, could take satisfaction in having achieved his primary objectives. The American Expeditionary Forces had maintained their independence, fought as a cohesive national army, and played a decisive role in ending the war. The doubters who had questioned American military capabilities had been silenced forever. The human drama of the moment was captured in countless individual stories. Families in small American towns received telegrams announcing that their sons had survived the war. Wives and sweethearts began planning for reunions they had feared might never come. Churches across America held services of thanksgiving for the end of the slaughter that had consumed Europe. But the end of fighting did not mean the end of American responsibilities in Europe. The occupation of Germany, the complex negotiations over territorial adjustments, and the massive task of demobilizing the American Expeditionary Forces would require months of additional effort. The war was over, but the peace would prove equally challenging. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had lasted 4 to 7 days and involved over 1 million American soldiers. It was the largest and most costly battle in American military history up to that time, with casualties exceeding 120,000. But it had achieved its strategic objective, the defeat of German forces and the end of the Great War. As the guns fell silent across the Western Front, survivors on both sides began a long process of coming to terms with what they had experienced. The war that was supposed to end all wars had instead set the stage for an even more terrible conflict just 20 years in the future. But on November 11, 1918, in the forests of northeastern France, peace had finally come to a world that had forgotten what it meant to live. Without the sound of artillery, the Meuse-Argonne offensive was over, and with it, an entire era of human history had come to an end.